Welcome to Things Go Sideways. Things Go Sideways is a space for honest conversations about the moments when experience, expertise, or success doesn't prevent things from breaking down, and when pushing harder is no longer the answer. These are stories about what happens when something in your work or life stops being sustainable, even if it looks successful from the outside. Today, I'm joined by Vidar Hokstad. He's spent more than 3 decades in the tech world as a founder, a builder, an advisor, a fractional CTO. He's been early, he's scaled fast, he's exited, and he's lived with the consequences of it all. Vidar, thank you so much for being here and for being willing to talk about the parts of the journey that don't neatly fit into a highlight reel.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great being here.
So I want to get started with what I think is a softball question, but you never know. When you look back across your career, what's one sideways moment you couldn't engineer your way out of, even with all of your experience?
Oh, so there's been many. Ironically, since I do a lot of software engineering, not really the actual technical issues, but more on the entrepreneurship side, where I would say a problem that I've run into several times, which is a common issue if you take venture capital. I've been getting into a situation where basically the investors are calling the shots. And that doesn't matter so much when everything is going straight up. When everything's going the right way, and the investors will sit back and let you do your thing. But there has been, several of the startups that I've been part of that didn't do as well. I mean, 9% plus of startups fail. And there's been a couple of those cases where the investors made decisions that I fought long and hard against, and it didn't go my way. There's nothing I can do about it. And it's really hard to then sort of sit back and try to put that aside and, accept that this is how it is. You just need to move on from it.
I have a personality question because, I think that if you've gone through an experience like that, a lot of people would say, gosh, why would you put yourself through it more than once? What was the thing that would drive you? Seem to be a smart person and so what was it and what is it that sort of drives you to continue to try or to continue to try new things?
I think the interesting thing, which I kind of learned with my first startup, which I sort of co-founded when I was 19, was that failing with the startup isn't nearly as scary as it sounds. It's really painful when you're right in the middle of it. So the first company I started was an internet provider back in the dial-up days. And we knew nothing about business whatsoever when we started. We thought we knew the technology, but we were studying computer science and decided, let's go and start an internet provider. We had no idea what went on behind the scenes. And we got the technology bit working, but we also managed to start a price war with the large incumbent telco. And we didn't have their war chest. And so we salvaged what we could, sold off the dial-up bit, got some contract work for various businesses, hosting websites, that kind of thing. But that it wasn't really sustainable. So we ended up looking for an exit. And what happened, and I see this as a failure. The business survived for a bit after that. And it wasn't really, it's not like it collapsed completely. But we ended up getting out in the form of, we had paid off our investor, and his lawyer basically headhunted us to one of his other clients. And so, what on the surface felt like a complete failure and was really gut-wrenching when it happened, resulted in us going from sort of living on what little we could take out of the business to getting a salary that was well above average for our age range overnight with this new employer. So
wow.
Yeah, and this has kind of been a recurring theme. Has been that even when a startup isn't going all that well, it's never been a lasting problem. I never ended up being unemployment for a long period, for example, because one of the upsides of doing this startup is that you learn a lot in a very compressed timeline. And that's attractive. So I feel like I've come out of every single startup had fun better off than what I was going in, even if not necessarily from earning all that much money from all of the startups.
I feel like if you're going into like this idea of doing multiple startups in your life, you might as well say that you're committed to sideways moments because you're going to have a lot of them.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
So early in your career, when you think about startups and entrepreneurship, speed and momentum, they're assets. They are absolutely things that you are leveraging and trading on. Was there a moment when those same strengths started to work against you?
It's hard to say because part of what I see as a strength there is the willingness to take risks. And obviously, there are cases where those risks don't play out. And in that cases, yeah, you can say that, well, I'm taking too much risk. On the other hand, when you're doing a startup, well, if you don't take enough risk, you might end up with a business that survives, but it's just slowly trundling along and it's not getting you where you want it to be. And so I try to not see them as failures in that respect. I mean, I worked with it. Well, I was the first hire basically at a startup about a decade ago, where one of the co-founders was actually an employee of one of my previous startups. So that's how I got involved. The other co-founder, his mentality was, well, we are going to try to bring this to like unicorn level quickly within a year or two, or at least get the growth going. And if you didn't see the growth going like straight up, that was it. We had a couple of years and then we either made it big or we moved on. And we ended up moving on. We sold off the business because we got to a stage where our next funding round wasn't going too well. The existing investors were willing to put in more money, but at terms that would have basically stunted our growth. For us personally, the investors would have done okay because they would have diluted us very heavily. But we basically decided that, well, it wasn't worth it if we were left with this little. So we sold off everything instead. So that's kind of the attitude that you need going into it if you're going to do a startup and make it big. And I love doing that when I was younger. Now I'm kind of like moving more towards, well, I'm happy with more of a lifestyle business, slower growth and less risk. But it was fun having done it, and I learned tremendous amount from it.
So you talk about things that you've learned along the way and how being in different seasons of your life have led you to choose different paths as far as the way you want to live and work. You've lived through big wins. You've lived through hard consequences. You've lived through legal battles. You've lived through burnout. Which one hit you in a way that you didn't expect?
I mean, burnout is the worst thing for me to deal with, rather than much more so than like a company failing. Burnout, well, I said burnout, and I'd say having to fire people. Because I think if a company fails and it's just the founders, I mean, that's fine. It doesn't matter. It affects people who have gone into it, taking the risk and potentially getting huge payout if things work. But actually, the company that I moved over to the UK with, originally from Norway, when I moved over in 2000, it was with a company that we had gotten around financing about $1 million. We were about to close on about $6.5 million for second round. And then shortly after we closed, actually, the bottom of the dot-com boom ended, the crash happened, and we basically had to buckle down, and we soon had to start firing people because we had hired on the basis of spending that second round financing in a few months and going out and getting more money, and that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And that was brutal because having to sit down and like evaluate people and try to figure out, well, who could we afford to keep and who did we need, that was absolutely horrible. It's much worse like if you're letting somebody go because they have done something wrong. You might feel bad about it, but you're not going to feel that bad about it because it's their own fault. But in this case, they had done nothing wrong. We had failed to anticipate what's going to happen. So that's absolutely a brutal one. But at the same time, that company was probably where I experienced one of my worst burnouts. And it took a while to recognize that because it had been a brutal run up to things. And we went through a tough phase there while we were trying to keep things going. That made it really, really hard. And you don't, it creeps up on you. That's the thing. You just find that you have less energy. You get myopically focused on just keeping things going and you stop looking at the big picture.
What helped you to begin looking at the big picture again? I think that a lot of people who are listening to something like Things Go Sideways might be going through something like burnout. They might be going through an experience like that and saying, oh my gosh, I'm barely keeping things together. How do I get out of this?
I mean, in my case, I was lucky enough to basically move on to a job which was like absolutely like coasting compared to that startup. We got to a stage basically, we were scaling down from about 50 people to 7. And at one point, it got to a point where it was like, well, okay, I need to go because the company can't afford to keep me around and doesn't need me at this scale. And so I got a job managing a billing system for Europe at Yahoo. Yahoo was a big company at the time, about 10,000 people. I spent my days in meetings, protecting my engineering team from product managers. But a big company is a completely different beast, like to a small company like that. And it's like a vacation. I mean, it's like, yes, you can have job pressure. Yes, you can end up going from meeting to meeting, and there might be, there's high expectations, but it's predictable. And there are support functions around you. You have HR,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. You have the office manager. You don't need to do everything. Whereas in some of the startups I've done, I've had to go from doing like software engineering one moment, doing phone sales.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Calls late at night. I had one job where we at one point answered support calls at like 3 a.m. in the morning on Sunday because we were not anyone.
It's so true. I mean, I feel like when you have worked for yourself or you've created a startup or you've had like a small business, even a business that grows and it becomes larger and larger, you have to wear so many hats and there's so much that's on your shoulders, so much responsibility, the heaviness, the weight of that is immense. It's also your thing. And there's this ownership of it that all roads lead to your decisions and what you do next and the energy you wake up with and how you solve problems. When you go to something that's a lot larger, you go and you're working and you're in this big corporate environment. It's like, yes, I understand there's a lot of pressure, but it can't match all of the weight that is on my shoulders. I've talked with a lot of people before who they've said once they created their own business, once they went to work for themselves, no matter what they did, they could, like, even if they tried, they ultimately came back to working for themselves. Is your story similar? I mean,
To an extent, yes.
yeah? Okay,
Yeah,
talk to me about that.
yeah, so, I mean, I've gone through various stints of working at slightly larger companies, but Yahoo was by far the biggest. Most of the other companies I've worked at has been smaller. Now I work for quite large clients, but it's a very different situation when you're an outsider and you're there to do a specific task and then you leave and you don't get caught up in all of the other stuff. Part of the reason why I'm currently, doing consulting instead of doing another startup as well is because I found that, I've gotten to a point where I'm getting too expensive for the startups, but they can afford to hire me on a fractional basis or to solve specific problems, but I'm not generally the right person for them on a full-time basis. And I like that because I get to experience a much wider selection and I get to set my own schedule and decide what I'm working on and fit in my own little bootstrap projects on the side. So it's not like I haven't given up doing a startup, but I'm doing it at a slower pace these days. But the big corporate environments, they're too relaxing. They're too predictable. I mean, it was great working at Yahoo it was about 3 years, but it was great because I needed somewhere where I could just do my job and, clock out and not think about how we were going to make, how we were going to get revenue and that kind of thing. And Yahoo was a great place to work. And there's a lot of really smart people there at the time. I've changed a lot since then, but it was a great place. But it was ultimately not somewhere I would have stayed for a long term. It was just too big. So I went to work for another startup.
There's a big difference between, and you've been sharing some of those, a big difference between being a founder, becoming an advisor, or a fractional leader. What had to break or what had to change? What did you have to understand about yourself before that shift became possible? What have you learned about yourself through these different role changes?
I started basically looking at consulting because I was getting bored in a relatively regular job with a small company again. So I was technical director at a web design agency, and it's a great group of people to work with, but it was getting boring and the business was changing. And so I got an opportunity to take on a contract, and I went to my boss at the time and said, hey, I know the finances of the business. I knew that he couldn't really afford to have me. I also knew that he would never fire me. I mean, I'm still doing the occasional contract job for him today, like 10 years later. But it was better for both of us if I stepped down to part-time and started doing contracting on the side.
Mm.
So that's what I started doing contracting. And it was kind of like a soft way for me of dipping my toes in and maybe thinking of going back to do a startup. But I realized I liked the contracting because I got to do more varied things without the full. I wasn't the one worried about whether or not the company was growing beyond whether or not they were able to pay the bills and whether I delivered my share of it. And so that was fun. But what happened a couple of times actually was that I had clients that went, oh, can't you join full time? And so the last time was about 5 years ago now, when I ended up joining a venture capital firm that had been my consulting client. And I just got back out again and started doing contracting a couple of years ago. But this time I'm sticking with this now. It was tempting when you have clients coming and wanting to hire you. Especially in that case, it was a very new experience for me to be on the other side of the table for a change. And it was an exciting idea. It's a venture capital fund that wanted to do things quite differently. But I enjoy the consulting part a bit more. I enjoy having multiple clients to work with and get to do more varied things.
Mm. Were there any themes or sort of signs that you learned to recognize in yourself? Did you start feeling itchy when it was about time to sort of change and move into a different phase of your life or to look for the next thing? Because I feel like for some people, they begin to see signs and they try to ignore them. Maybe they don't want the discomfort of change. What have you learned about yourself? Did you have any of those? Do you have those?
Well, yeah. I mean, this venture capital fund, for example, I would probably stay there longer if it wasn't for the fact that water investors bought out the entire fund. And they basically, I mean, they knew that most of us actually wouldn't want to continue. So I got a very generous offer where they offered me to continue working in a new capacity within their organization, or a generous buyout. And they told me very honestly that they didn't think I'd be happy there because their environment was, large pension fund provider, massive bureaucracy. I mean, I knew that because it had taken me about 6 months just to figure out a way to transfer the data from our old systems into their corporate systems between the numerous people involved in getting approvals. And I agreed with him. I, took the buyout and I went back to my consulting business. But I think, had I stayed in that business at the time, I'd already started feeling the itch because things had changed. The management had changed and it was becoming very corporate. And, I was starting to look at side projects. And when you start finding lots of energy for side projects, it's a sign you're not really engaged.
Right. It is probably that look for like, what else is there? What else could be, I've got either room or like I'm getting bored or something where it's like something's got to give. Now, one question I like to ask people when I'm talking with them about their sideways stories is, it's one thing to deal internally with times of change, and you might be somebody who can adapt well or work through change and handle it better. It's another thing to deal with the people around us. We're humans that oftentimes have complicated relationships with the world around us. So were there people around you who were really wanting you to just say, stay stable and do one thing for a lot longer and like, don't change? Or are you surrounded by people who are like, nope, we believe in you and like, go do what you need to do?
I've been lucky in that respect. I think, obviously it's a lot easier when it's just you. And I mean, when
Yeah.
I was 19, I there's no risk involved. I had to have things gone sideways and I hadn't found something better. I've, been able to go back to my childhood bedroom and, no,
Yeah.
there's no risk involved, basically. That risk has certainly been higher later, after I bought a house and stuff like that. But I've been lucky that, even exes that I have a hard time talking about have generally been supportive about it. So I think, it comes down to they've seen that I've always landed on my feet. And it's a very different things if you're taking risks and consistently failing because you're not putting enough effort in or because you're just not very figured out what you're doing. But longest I've been out of a job has been about a month in 30 years. So it doesn't feel like I'm taking risks as much as, it's calculated. Obviously, there's some risk there, but it's calculated. You need to make sure to build up savings. You need to be prepared and ready for the sideways moves. Then you get the support. And, my current fiance has been, very supportive of everything I've done with my consulting business and so on. So I've been lucky that way. But yeah, it also takes actually being prepared so that people have a reason to trust in you.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think that a lot of times we learn important lessons from these sideways stories. In your work today, how directly does it trace back to those sideways experiences that you've had? Not just the lessons, but also the costs.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think every one of them has taught me a great deal. I mean, all the way back to my first company, the first lesson I got was like a month after launch, really, when we started this price war. And because we didn't understand that pricing, the existing pricing was not necessarily telling us anything about our competitors' cost models. And we didn't do any projections or any analysis before we decided that, we're going to go head to head with the biggest competitors we can find. To, more recently in terms of how I've worked with development teams, and I might not seem like it, but I'm a very introverted person, and it takes a lot out of me to spend time interacting with people all day and stuff like that, and I need my quiet time afterwards to recharge. So learning how to actually basically avoid turning in on myself and avoiding those conversations, was something I also had to learn by failing to do it and realizing that my team is like crumbling because I'm not spending enough time talking to them, and starting to use various strategies to make sure that I didn't do that again.
Ooh, what were some of those strategies? I might need some of those.
One of the first ones that I picked up was I was literally walking in a room at one place where I had started. Basically, I put the blinkers on. I was pretty burned out at that point, so that was part of the reason that made it worse. But I was sitting by my desk and, I was really just focused on doing stuff instead of managing the team. And especially, this is like a very common problem with managers from a technical background, is that we are so used to actually getting deep in the zone and doing stuff, which is the right thing to do when you're in the earliest startup phase and you just have to build.
Yeah.
But when you start building a team under you, you need to start shifting your focus and splitting your time. And so I started walking a room and I'm talking to people, and some people are quite confused at first what happened.
They're like, why are you talking to me now?
Exactly. But also later, doing things like making sure that I always had actual one-on-one calls in the diary. And I had developers that would come to these calls and say, well, I don't have anything to talk about. Can we skip the call? And I said, no, we have blocked out this time and we're going to talk. Because I also realized that when I didn't do this, at one point I was managing a team in the US from London. And I was over every 6 to 8 weeks. And the first few times I went over, I spent basically a week listening to people whining. And this was because they had not come to me with things before they got bad.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of interpersonal conflict that festered for 6 to 8 weeks while I was away. And then I came back and had to resolve all of it. And all that just mostly anyway went away when I started basically forcing them to be on a call with me one-on-one and talking about whatever was going on. Because it turned out that as soon as they knew that they didn't get out of the call, a lot of things started surfacing that they didn't feel was important enough to do a call for.
Interesting.
That they talked about when they were in the meeting anyway. And
wow. That is fascinating. So by sort of forcing the conversation to happen on both sides, like we're not just going to rush through it and then end it. We're going to take this
Yeah,
time.
exactly. It's like you have my time.
Yes.
So do you want it? I
Anything. Yes.
You're telling me something interesting.
I love that. Oh my gosh. I love that because I'm also someone who I think people would be surprised to find out that like to stay kind of isolated and on my own, And so I'll be like, if somebody needs something, they can come to me. But I think that proactive, this is the allotted time. We're going to use it no matter what. Neither one of us is getting out of this just by saying, I don't have anything to bring up.
Yeah, I mean, there's always something to talk about. I mean,
Yeah.
if there genuinely weren't any like stuff going on with the team dynamics or whatever, then we could always pull back to things like personal development. What training are you going to do? How are you going to develop you? So there's always something you can talk about.
Yeah. Isn't it crazy how long, it's like we get better and better and better, and we figure out the solutions to problems that we have all along the way. And then it's like, oh man, I wish I could take all of this and then go back in time and redo everything that I've done before. So, this has been a fantastic conversation. And I feel like there's so many lessons that you can share. But if there is somebody that's out there that they're in the middle of building something impressive, but they are feeling maybe quietly depleted or misaligned, what feels honest to say to them right now?
When you need to try to take some time to recharge, basically, because it feels like obviously you're slowing down, but really burnout will slow you down more than anything else. So, don't move too fast. And I know that's something you don't want to hear if you're right in the middle of building something. You need to, deadlines and stuff like that. But sometimes you just need to take a day off and rest and recover. And sometimes you need a week or a month. But the sooner you take the breaks, the shorter they will be. If you give yourself time often enough, you're not going to hit the wall. And if you first properly hit the wall, it can take a long time to get back to where you can have energy to get things up.
Do you have any preferred self-care practices, habits, or anything that you go to regularly in order to sort of regulate your nervous system or stay in a good space?
Well, I like to go for long walks, but another practice I picked up about 18, 20 years ago when I started meditating. I don't do it often enough, but there's a fantastic book called Mindfulness in Plain English that basically starts out by making it clear that, well, while the author is a Buddhist monk, the book is an instruction manual. It does not try to preach to you about anything spiritual.
Yeah.
It's purely, this is like a step-by-step instruction manual, and it sticks to that. So it's very, very straightforward. It's very practical, focused on starting with breathing, starting with how to maintain focus, and so on, and how to address various issues along the way. And that was like, well, I saw the introduction, I was like, this is perfect. This was a way of trying it and see how it worked out. And for me, it's been very helpful at times. I have a persistent internal monologue going normally, and it only stops in one of two instances. And it's when I'm sleeping or it's when I'm meditating. Other than that, there's always, if I'm getting ready to, say, go on a podcast like this, my brain will be basically rehearsing for a couple of hours beforehand. If I know I'm going to do a phone call, I will be rehearsing that call in my head, no matter what else I'm doing. And it goes on and on. So that's basically my quiet time.
I love that. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you for staying with us in this conversation, for naming the costs, for sharing honestly the highs and lows and not just the outcomes of everything. One of the things that Things Go Sideways exists to do is to remind us that the experience doesn't just make us immune to the collapse, that it changes how the collapse shows up. So to everyone listening or watching this later, if there's something in your work that keeps asking for your attention, especially through exhaustion or doubt, you don't have to fix it today, but you might need to stop pretending it's just a phase. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.